I got a question for you. How do you think you would fare in a survival situation, like a real survival situation? You know, this is a fascinating topic apparently because, you know, even the media takes advantage of this concept to the point where there's a show called Survivor. And in fact, as part of my job at one point, I was in a class that was designed to talk and teach survival tactics. So we got this training. It was a two-person crew that came in to teach us. One was a retired from Special Forces. He had really interesting background militarily, and he had some real skills to share when it came to survival. And there's some things they pointed out. They're like, hey, if you're going to be in a situation where survival's key, then it would be helpful for you to have a survival kit. And a part of that kit could be something like a signaling device, make sure people can, you know, find you. A shelter, obviously, to stay out of the elements. There would be a need for fire, and they're like, it's amazing the morale boost that a group can get from building a fire when you're out in the wilderness trying to survive. Just the warmth, and it gives you, you know, just a good feeling. And then you need water and some food, and then a first aid kit would be critical as well. Now, you know, they spelt out these elements of a survival kit, and then they took us outside and they put some of that to use. So they taught us how to make the shelter with the tools that they gave us, and so on. But it wasn't so much all of those technical aspects that stuck with me as much as what they said at one point in the classroom. You know, when you look at these survival shows, I can remember my kids watching some of them, and this gentleman would be out in the wilderness, he'd come across this carcass, and he's like, you got to have your protein, so you got to eat that. And these guys are like, don't do that. You're going to cause more problems trying to eat something like that than what any kind of benefit from protein would give you. And they said, listen to this. You can survive in the wilderness for 3 weeks without food. You can survive in the wilderness 3 days without water. You can even survive 3 minutes without air. There have been those who have been underwater and come back to life after 3 minutes without air. He says, but you won't last 3 seconds without the critical element that we're going to talk about here in the Scripture. Now, when it comes to survival in the Scripture, there's one who knows it well. His name is Paul. I think most of you know who Paul is. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 27, listen to what Paul experienced. He says, from the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, and journeys often, and perils of water, and perils of robbers, and perils of my own countrymen, and perils of the Gentiles, and perils in the city, and perils in the wilderness, and perils in the sea, and perils among false brethren, and weariness and toil, and sleeplessness often, and hunger, and thirst, and fasting often, and cold, and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily. That's quite a resume of challenge, struggle, and survival. Now, most of our story today is going to come from the book of Acts, so if you want to turn to Acts chapter 27. And we're going to start reading in verse 9. But before we start reading this amazing event that Paul endured, a little background on how he got here. Paul was preaching and he was debating truth of God, and as often happens, there was a kind of a mob rule occurred, and they accused Paul of sedition and other things. And so the soldiers stepped in and they brought Paul basically into custody. And at the time in this area of Caesarea, Felix was the governor, and he listened to Paul's testimony. And the Bible tells us that Paul was with Felix for 2 years. And Felix was kind of dragging out because he thought, well, maybe he'd get a bribe out of this. He'd get some money, and then I can release him. But that didn't occur. So for 2 years, Paul was there. And after that time, Felix was replaced by a governor named Festus. And when Festus came into power, the Jews plotted against Paul to have him brought to Jerusalem so that they could ambush him. But Festus said that, well, the Jews would have to come to Caesarea to accuse Paul. And ultimately, wanting to do the Jews a favor, Festus asked Paul if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem to be judged in Jerusalem. But Paul, being a Roman citizen, knew that, something was up here. So he appeals to be brought to Caesar for judgment. So that's what he was granted. He had to make a voyage now from Caesarea all the way to Rome. Before that happened, another group came in. It was King Agrippa and his wife Bernice. And they listened to Paul, and he explains his testimony and his belief. And that's one of those really sad instances is where King Agrippa says, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. So we pick it up here where Paul now has to board a ship and make a voyage across the sea. Verse 9, now when much time had been spent, the sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over. It says Paul advised them. Now Paul's going to advise them because he knew full well that this time of year the waters got treacherous. In fact, it says here the fast is referring to the Day of Atonement, and it would have been in late September or early October, well into the risky season of travel. The Romans regarded, the time between like end of May to middle of September as the safe season for travel by ship. To do so between mid-September and earlier November was risky, and after mid-November, it was life-threatening. Now, we're from the Great Lakes. We understand something about the dangers that come with November. There's a Canadian singer-songwriter who talks about the Edmund Fitzgerald right in Lake Superior in November. In fact, he says, when the gales of November come slashing. And that would be something they were well acquainted with in this region here as well. I told Andy this morning, I said, I'm glad I have a Navy man here, and he about fell over. He grabbed his heart. He says, I was Army. But he was Army, but what were you in the Army? He was a mariner. So did you know that the Army has mariners? So he spent his time on the sea. So that gives you an idea of the perils. And I pick it up here in verse 10. It says, saying, men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and with much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So you get a little sense on the map up here on the wall. Phoenix is out there in that little island called Crete. So you can see the path that this ship was going to have to take. Now it continues here in verse 13. It says, when the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete, but not long after a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Now that term doesn't mean much to you and I, but I'm going to come back to Andy and pick on him for a minute. Where are you from, Andy? All over. New England. If I were to say to a New Englander, there's going to be a nor'easter coming, that drums up some images of tempestuous weather. Yeah, that can be an issue. That's what this word means to those people on that day. It was going to be a nor'easter. It was going to be something difficult to navigate and to survive. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of the island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. That would be like their lifeboat. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. Now I'm trying to wrap my mind around this. It appears that they're afraid the hull is going to give way, so they're binding it with whatever they had. Cables, ropes. We need to shore the ship up the best we can. And fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now that's a big statement, because this could be critical items. It could mean sails. It could mean items that normally you would hold dear to this mission, but it's getting so dangerous they have to lighten the ship so they don't run aground unknowingly. Anybody that thought the Bible reading was boring, they haven't read this story. My palms are starting to sweat. Get nervous for them. It goes on to say, now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. You can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air, but you won't last 3 seconds without hope. There's a scripture that we don't look at often to talk about hope. If I mentioned to you it's 1 Corinthians 13:13, you would know that as the love chapter. And this is what it says. And now abide faith, hope, and love, these three. But the greatest of these is love. That's what it says. When I think about, really there's only two kinds of people in the world, those who believe and those who don't believe, essentially. When I think about love, this is what John says in chapter 15:13. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And I know for a fact there are unbelievers who love friends, family, so much that they would do this. They would lay their life down. And there are believers who do that. There's sort of this equal ground there that they can relate to, that we can all kind of relate to there. Now when it comes to faith, you would say, well, maybe a believer's faith is different than the unbeliever, and that's true. Okay, there could be a difference there, for sure. But if I were to look in the faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. When I think about those who don't grasp or believe in, say, creation, they would believe in, say, a Big Bang. The fact is, they weren't there when it happened. So by faith, in the evidence that they feel is strong, but by faith, they would say it was a Big Bang. And likewise, the believer, by faith, we say we weren't there when creation happened, but I have a book here that I believe in, and it tells me how it happened, so I have faith that that took place. But in both cases, you could say faith exists in both groups. I would ask you, What does the unbeliever have when it comes to hope? This is an element that the believer has. We have that hope. It's that blessed hope. No matter how things devolve or become challenging here, we have something to look forward to. We have hope to rest on. We know there's a better day coming. But in this case, in Paul's experience, this was getting so bad that all hope that they would be saved was finally given up. Let's read on. Let's see what happens.